Dylan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining today from this space-themed Zoom room that you got. Are you calling me from Colorado? Is that right?
Yes, I'm in Denver. Great to be with you, Patrick. How are you?
You're in Denver. I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. Yeah, life's good.
So let's jump into it. So you have this background in real estate, and then you jump into space. And what's interesting when I interview people that do space stuff is, of course, almost none of them have a space background because, aside from being at NASA, there's actually just not a space industry to really come from in the way that there obviously is for tech or automotive. But can you just give me the personal narrative? How did you get involved in space, given that although you have this early, bachelor's degree in engineering, so you clearly have some technical aptitude for it, there's nothing, that sort of marks you before 2015 or so that would tell me, oh, this guy's going to sort of build like the Berkshire Hathaway of space or the Y Combinator of space. And we can go into exactly what Voyager is, but give me the personal narrative.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, lifelong space fan. And actually, I was in the electronics industry for years and years. So I really have more of a technical background. And then I did get into real estate, finance, banking. So I've been in a lot of industries, but the common thread in my business career was running public companies. So that's really what I consider my expertise, is running businesses at scale, running multinational companies, running public companies. So that's really, I think, my skill set. I actually got involved in space much earlier than 15. It was about 2008. And it was really as an early stage investor. Eric Anderson, you might know, founded Space Adventures. He and I were friends. And I shared with him that I was super passionate about space, and we were brainstorming on how I could get involved and still be involved in my day job. And we came up with the fact that the industry really needed early stage capital at that time. And so that's how I got involved initially. And, just been a love affair with the industry ever since.
And so let's describe what Voyager is, because it's a holding company. So that makes me think you want to be like the Berkshire Hathaway for space, but I do think you play some sort of investing and incubating role. So maybe that's more like a Y Combinator of space. How do you see it? What's your sort of terrestrial equivalent?
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit complex, I know. We do have a space services division. I think that might be the Y Combinator part that people pick up on. And that's really to provide our infrastructure, which is quite robust, kind of infrastructure as a service for companies that are growing. But we really think of ourselves as an operating company, not a holding company. The difference is we're primarily growing via acquisition. So we're doing majority control transactions of companies that are mature, they're post-revenue, post-profit, cash flow positive. And we're really building the company to scale, focused on three areas. One is destinations, so private space stations. Second is orbital servicing. And third is cislunar infrastructure.
And who's your chief investor? Where's the money coming for?
Well, we have a lot of third-party capital that we've raised, and we're on a path to hopefully file to go public later this year. Our investment bank is JP Morgan, so we're going through that process right now. But we've raised quite a bit of third-party capital. So that's, it's primarily family offices, a few institutions. But I think right now, total investor base is about 185 investors.
Oh, wow. And am I right that, in a sense, the basic thesis is that while the layperson and, perhaps even, quite educated people tend to think of space as sort of a distant economy, there's quite a bit more happening that's, some of it's behind the scenes, some of it with Richard Branson and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos is obviously quite out there in public. But the sense I get from watching your other interviews and looking at your website is that this is all happening sooner than people expect.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think also the thesis is the new space phenomenon is real, right? It's been promised for years and years, but it's actually real now. We built the elevator to space, so to speak, and now all these business plans close. What's not happening particularly well is the companies aren't scaling particularly well. And so really what Voyager is all about is taking the best of new space, but really providing the infrastructure and call it the public company envelope to really run it at scale. And the idea is you assemble capability, not market share, right? And as you assemble capability, you ultimately can service more and more parts of the market and ultimately create more and more value for the industry.
Your space elevator analogy I've heard before, but it's probably worth unpacking in just 20 to 30 seconds for people who aren't aware of it.
Yeah, so we roughly have reduced the cost of launch by 100x just in the last 10, 15 years. Really credit Elon. I mean, I know SpaceX can be controversial, but honestly, they have cracked the nut. We have now reliable, reusable, inexpensive launch. And if Starship works, which again, I would never bet against SpaceX, we're going to have another 10x improvement in launch capability. So it really is extraordinary. And so a lot of these business plans now close. I mean, previously the space shuttle was about 100,000 pounds $100,000 per pound to orbit. And now we're right around, I think, 2,000 on our way to, 200.
And so could you just give me a sense of what do you think the space economy is defined by now? And how quickly will that change in terms of the definition of what's going on up there, and maybe how it's impacting ordinary people who don't think of themselves as necessarily caring about space in as little as, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years? I mean, is it changing that quickly?
It is. Yeah. And to me, we go to space to benefit Earth, right? So it's not billionaire escape, Elysium effect, all these kinds of narratives. I totally reject that. I think it's hugely beneficial to Earth. A lot of Earth observation data drives our climate policy, and I have 100 examples. Plus, every business plan coming out of Silicon Valley uses the GPS constellation, right?
Right.
But when I think about the sort of categories, last 10 years has really been defined by launch, right? That's where a lot of the capital has gone. I think the next 10 years will be defined by destinations. So where are we actually going? And I think it's going to be replacement to the International Space Station. And I think we'll have 8 to 12 of those private space stations. And then certainly we're going to go back to the moon. And then further afield, probably early 2030s, I think we'll go back to Mars. The most investable asset class in addition to destinations is satellite constellations, right? Ones and zeros. It's pretty capitally efficient, once the constellation is up. So I anticipate, something like 10,000 satellites launched in the next 36 months. And just to give people perspective, I think there's a total of 1,700 in orbit today. So we're going to, 4x what's currently in orbit.
And you're trying to position Voyager and maybe even the entire spectrum of things going up in space as an ESG investment. That's definitely not intuitive, although I'd like you to unpack the argument. One reason I find it so compelling is, there is this narrative that you see, it might be journalists, it might be late night comics, but there's this sense of which our planet is burning and all the billionaires are spending their money on a different planet or different trajectory altogether. And so maybe people just don't get that the far reaching consequences could end up obviously helping this planet. I suppose my analogy would be, if it was 1492 and you're sort of, speaking in Spain and Portugal about the idea of going to this this new world instead of improving Europe, is that a proper analogy? Because obviously the amount of things that happened over the last 500 years would not have been foreseeable. And, one often thinks of even Steve Jobs had a pretty poor sense in a certain way of what the iPhone would actually be used for, by now, right? Or the drone industry, what it was used for versus what it's actually doing now is totally different, right? And space is just 3 orders of magnitude greater. I mean, do we even have a sense of what the possibilities are in space, and how do you position the ESG investment trend towards opening those possibilities?
Yeah, tremendous question. A lot of density in your question, but let me unpack it a little bit. So first of all, space is a lot of things, including an investment opportunity, which we just talked about. But in my opinion, primarily it is first and foremost a tool for transformation. And what do I mean by that? Part of the reason we, in my opinion, have all these intractable problems and don't treat each other particularly well is because we have the wrong viewpoint, the wrong perspective. And to a person, and I've been blessed to probably meet, 75 or 80 people who've been to space of all varieties and nationalities and backgrounds. And to a person, they have been tremendously impacted, both from an environmental perspective, understanding the fragility of Earth, but understanding the folly of just kind of how we treat each other. So I think part of it is getting out of the fishbowl and looking back and observing that, we're fish swimming in water, so to speak, and just getting that new perspective. Secondly, I think that the world needs a lot more hope and inspiration, right? There's not a lot to be excited about for young people. A lot of young people are off kilter and they're worried about climate, as they should be, in the future. And so I think anything that's inspirational and hopeful and portends for a brighter future, I think is important, unless we're going to lose an entire generation, right? So I think all those things are important. Now on ESG, for us, it's not a check the box. This is an absolute must. And we want to provide leadership in this. And it's 3 different categories. And one is we have a big ag tech initiative, which I know sounds crazy, But because we have private sovereign real estate on the International Space Station with our commercial airlock, we're actually going to put greenhouses on the outside of that in partnership with the UAE. It's called Starlab Oasis. And the idea is to pioneer seed technology, because the ultimate desert is space. And as you pioneer that technology, you can address food scarcity here on Earth. So that's one category. Second category, we have a public benefit corporation called Dream Up. And this is owned by our subsidiary NanoRacks. And this is all about schools and young people being able to actually create their own satellite and have it launched under our mission management. So imagine running a mission as a high school class, right? So again, back to that inspiration and STEM piece. And then the third, probably most important, is the whole D&I piece. And it's critical, right? If you think about how difficult space is, we can't do it with 5% of our society or 10% of our society, right? We need everybody, and not just STEM educated, artists, business people, journalists, up and down the society. So I think inspiring people to get involved is critical. Voyager, I think we're one director away from having an all-female board, which I'm proud of. I mean, I think that's, and by the way, they're all rock stars. So the idea is you have to compromise quality for diversity is just nonsense. So for us, ESG is a priority. It's a low bar in our industry, frankly, and we want to provide leadership in this direction.
I want to come back to Dream Up in a second, but there's just a little chat with the moderators there that I don't know where your mic is positioned, but sometimes there's like a static that comes across to me. I don't know if it's heard otherwise, and if we're recording locally, I assume it's not a problem, but they just want to say if you could try to not interfere with the mic wherever that is.
Roger. Okay.
Okay. Okay, let's come back to Dream Up for a second. So I guess I get interested in this question because I have, daughters that are 1 year old and 3 years old, and it's sort of unfathomable to me that, instead of going off to university in Europe, 20 years from now, maybe they're going to university on the moon, right? I have no idea how plausible that is, but I don't think I can be convinced that that's remotely feasible, right? It's just outside the scope of my imagination. It's just not something I could grapple with. But Dream Up is interesting in that, in order to get space to the next level, you really do need to inspire the younger generation. And so just give me a sense of what Dream Up is already doing, and then, what the aspirations are for the program.
Right. So one of our core capabilities, again, via NanoRacks, one of our subsidiaries, is mission management on the International Space Station. And by that, what we mean is running experiments, running other people's experiments, getting hardware on station, having the astronauts manipulate that hardware, and then sending the data back or sending the hardware back. So, basically running experiments. And as part of that, we can actually do that for schools, universities, high schools, nonprofits, and, basically give them a kit that they can, create an envelope on whatever telemetry they want to collect. And then on a normal cargo resupply, bring that hardware up, ultimately launch it out of our airlock, and then they're in orbit, which is pretty extraordinary. Because if they had to do that on their own and pay for a launch, it would be ridiculously cost prohibitive. So the idea is making space tangible, making the idea of running a space mission something that they can latch onto. And of course, it's a collaborative effort. They need to figure it out on their side. We're not building the satellite for them. They need to come up with the business plan and the idea and all that. So I think it's a great approach, and it's very tangible, and I think it's really getting traction.
Can you mention something specific that you're most excited about? Something that probably goes under the radar. Up to you, either whether it's already happening and people just aren't aware, or it's just in development. But I mean, what's something sort of breathtaking that's taking place in space right now?
Well, I don't know how breathtaking it is, but it's important. It's back to ESG, which is space sustainability. So we've got a space debris issue, and I'm really proud. SpaceX, I credit them, Lockheed, several other companies. We collaborated on the space sustainability rating. And the idea, think of it as LEED, back to real estate, LEED certification. And the idea is you would certify your hardware on how sustainable it is. But this is really important, Patrick. I mean, we could literally pollute in orbit. I think a screw in orbit is about 100 pounds of TNT if it collides with something, because it's moving so fast. So it's a tragedy of the commons, right? Classically. And so I think as a society, a global society, we really need to get out in front of this. We've chosen to do this via the World Economic Forum, because that's probably the best platform today, but we really need others involved in this. It's a really, really important issue.
And so I believe we've titled this talk, a view from the US, right? So a lot of our viewers are going to be in Britain and Europe. What lessons do you have, and what sense do you have that there's not enough innovation happening in Europe versus, they're making all the right steps? Like, are there mistakes that need to be learned from and corrected right away? Or do you see a lot of ambitious startups and, right policies coming out of Europe?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of Europe in general. I've lived in Europe for many years, so I think I understand the business culture. First of all, let me just say that I think the natural state of business is to globalize. Space has been less global, mainly because of regulatory concerns, right? ITAR and some of these regulations. But I think over time, especially as our strategic partners, the US strategic partners, are expanded, I would anticipate more global coordination and cooperation, which is good. In terms of investment, I think the general, kind of platitudes apply where, generally speaking, it's a bit risk adverse in Europe compared to the US. And generally speaking, there's less capital available. But, I think at the same time, for great entrepreneurs and great business leaders, it's a very stable market. It's a very easy to understand market, in my humble opinion. And valuations are much lower. I mean, much lower. I think valuations here in the US have really gotten pretty extreme. So there's pros and cons. There's super smart people everywhere in the world, as we know. But if it was up to me, if I could wave my wand, I wish Europe was slightly more less risk adverse. Maybe I'll put it that way. And I wish there was more early stage capital available. Those are the two things that I would try to address.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this might have to be my last question because we're running out of time. Maybe I'll fit in too. But, I lived in Germany for a while, and now I'm in California. And it strikes me that, off the top of my head, I think the top 6 companies, and probably, 7 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 15 are not just American, but really from the West Coast, right? Mostly in California, but you've got a couple in Washington. And, I'm just curious, like, the space economy at some stage will be a multi-trillion-dollar economy. And so is that almost like, okay, Europe has missed out to some extent on big tech and the idea that you create not just a great product, as Germany in particular is good at doing, but then creating it as a platform where the data itself becomes the product, right? So Europe to some extent has missed out on that. Does space offer, a harking back to, design and engineering that often Europeans are really, really good at? Or, is there a risk that the next stage, and SpaceX obviously is a good example, is continuing to be dominated by some of these Californian and, I suppose in this case, Texas companies?
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I don't see it as a winner take all. I think Europe is going to be a huge participant. I mean, look at what Luxembourg is doing, on the mineral rights and satellite constellation. They're way out in front. And a lot of companies have based themselves there. We're opening a Luxembourg office as well. So no, I think Europe's going to play a much larger role than, let's say, traditional tech. And I think part of that is just because there's, as you said, tremendous resources in Europe, both from a quality manufacturing standpoint, but design and engineering, supply chain. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure in Europe that applies to space that doesn't necessarily apply to tech. So I'm way more optimistic for Europe to participate in the upside.
Let me end with just a totally off-kilter question in terms of, your expectations for space. What year, maybe what decade, let's say, will it be that someone will literally be born in space, and spend the majority of their life? In other words, no longer Earthlings.
2030, that decade.
2030.
Not the year 2030, that decade. The 30s.
The decade. Okay.
Yeah.
Even so, that's
well, we're going to be on Mars in 2034, I think, and I'd say by 2038, 2039, that would be my over under for a human born in space.
Wow. Well, I guess God willing, we'll both be around to see whether that's true. That's amazing. Dylan, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with all of your efforts. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing what's next.
My pleasure. Thanks, Patrick.